Welcome to video 4 in the Matters of Fate playlist, and in this video we're going to be looking at aspects. Now, aspects are one of the most important parts of Fate, in my opinion, and they make it stand out from a lot of other games by incorporating a focus on story and narrative into the very mechanics of the game. Aspects go hand in hand with fate points, so we're also going to cover them in some detail in this video. The terms invoking and compelling are going to be used a lot in this video, and I give a description of these terms in the previous video on this list, which you can see by clicking there. But basically, invoking is spending a fate point when you have an appropriate aspect to gain either a +2 or a re-roll on a dice roll, whereas compelling is accepting a complication based on one of your aspects in return for a fate point. Okay, so what are aspects and fate points before we get into the nitty-gritty? Well, aspects are story tags or little phrases that describe something noteworthy about whatever they are attached to. Now, it could be weather conditions in a scene, a physical characteristic of an NPC, something about a player character's history, whatever. Fate points are pools of points possessed by both the GM and the players, normally represented by some kind of token, although this is not compulsory. Each player starts with a minimum number of fate points per session, and this is known as the character's refresh score. The GM normally has a pool of tokens per encounter equal to the number of players for use by his NPCs, although this may vary depending on which iteration of Fate or game you're using. Okay, so what types of aspect are there? Well, as we've said at the start, aspects are tags that can be applied to almost anything within a Fate game. For convenience, they're grouped into 5 broad categories, and these are game aspects, which are permanent fixtures of a campaign. Although they may change over time, they're always present and are considered to be available for use. Game aspects describe the issues or threats that exist in your campaign world, forming the basis for your stories. Everyone can invoke, compel, or create an advantage based on a game aspect at any time. Number 2, character aspects, and these are permanent but are attached to an individual PC or NPC, describing such things as personality traits, beliefs, background elements, possessions, physical features, relationships, problems, titles, and many, many more such things. For example, prone to erupting into violent fits of anger, I worship his divine shadow, Lord of Earlswood Manor, or I must avenge my sister's death, are all examples of character aspects. Character aspects can only be invoked or compelled when they are relevant. GMs can always propose compels to any player character. Players can suggest compels for other people's characters, but it's down to the GM as to whether or not it's a valid suggestion. We then move on to number 3, which is situation aspects, and these aspects are temporary, lasting only for a single scene or the duration of whatever situation it describes. And some examples might be rough terrain, smoke in the eyes, disarmed, lying prone, got them in my sight, heavy rainfall, etc. Now, who can use a situational aspect depends very much on the context of the aspect in question, but it should normally be very clear from the description, but the GM does have final say in this regard. We then move on to number 4, which is consequences, and consequences describe lasting injuries or problems that a PC or significant NPC has sustained, such as broken jaw, bloody nose, social outcast, etc. And they last for a variable amount of time depending on the severity of the consequence, and can be compelled during this time by anyone who can take advantage of them. And finally, number 5, we come to boosts. And these are the most temporary of all aspects. You normally get a boost when you're trying to create an advantage, but you don't quite succeed by enough, or as an added bonus if you succeed in style at an action. A boost is invoked for free, but once you've done so, or if it's left for too long, it disappears. So, why are aspects important? Well, Aspects help us define characters in the game fiction. They tell us what is important about those characters, and aspects are always true. So if, for example, you have an aspect, fastest space pilot in the Imperial fleet, then your character is the fastest pilot in the fleet. They're also a great way for players to tell the GM what sort of stories they want to see. For example, if you take the aspect, I owe a favour to the Capelli family, then as a GM, I can assume you want to see some stories involving organised crime. And straight away we know we have a mob family called the Capellis in our setting, and that for some reason your character owes them a favour, instantly creating potential future plot and drama. Aspects also add colour and interest to a scene. In my opinion, it's far more interesting to compel an aspect and say, well, because I threw sand in his eyes, he won't see my attack coming, than it is to say, well, because they're partially blinded, I get a +3 to my attack roll. Aspects are useful to GMs because they help tell us when to use the dice and when not to bother. For example, if you're crossing a wooden bridge over a ravine, that's fine, no dice necessary. However, if the bridge has the aspect of barely holding together a collection of rotting planks, then it might be interesting to break out the dice and ask for a test to see whether or not the PCs can race across the bridge before it finally collapses and plummets into the ravine below. So how do you make a good aspect? Well, often first-time players struggle with how to make aspects, either because they're not sure exactly how it works or because they're used to more numerically based RPG systems. And yes, it does take a little thinking about. However, there are a few tips that I can give for coming up with good aspects. And these are, the best aspects have a positive and a negative side. You want your aspects to have both this positive side so you can use them to get bonuses to rolls and help your characters succeed. However, you only gain fate points during a session if your aspects are compelled, so you also want them to have a negative side. For example, Private Detective is an okay aspect, however it's mainly positive, but something like Private Detective obsessed with the search for his missing partner has more scope for compels and hence is more likely to earn you fate points and enrich the game fiction. 2. Try and cover a multitude of different areas. Now, we gave you some examples of different things that aspects can cover earlier in this video. If you can, try to incorporate multiple different traits and aspects. Remember, if you're not using your aspects often, then there's not really much point having them. For example, our obsessed detective not only covers his occupation and his NPC connection with his partner, but also some sort of traumatic event in his past, his partner going missing. 3. Clarity. Make sure everyone understands how your aspects work. It's best if you phrase them clearly, or at least have a little bit of a discussion with people before the game starts. For example, whilst the aspect searching for Joe in the big city might sound evocative and very dramatic, it doesn't tell you nearly as much in plain English as the original detective obsessed with the search for his missing partner aspect that we created earlier. And finally, number 4, don't stress it. If you can't think of aspects at the start, first of all, try and think about what's important to your character, and don't be afraid to ask your GM or other players for help in phrasing them. And if you still can't think of them, then ask your GM if you can leave them blank until you can think of something later on in the game. It's not really going to affect the game balance, and most GMs will be quite happy with this. So now let's move on to how you can use your aspects in game, and this is by invoking or compelling them. We covered this briefly earlier, but for a slightly more detailed look we'll go into it now. Invoking. Well, when you find yourself making a dice roll and one or more of your aspects is relevant, then after you've made the dice roll, you may choose to spend a fate point and either add a +2 or re-roll your dice completely. You may also spend a fate point, as long as your aspect is relevant, to either add +2 to an ally's roll or add +2 to the passive resistance faced by an opponent. Now, please note that you may only use an individual aspect once per dice roll, but if you have more than one aspect that is relevant, then you may keep invoking as long as you've got fate points to spend. There are also free invocations, which occur occasionally when you succeed at creating an advantage, and these work just like normal invocations, but they do not cost fate points and are normally very temporary, but they can be stacked with normal invocations. We then move on to the other main way of using fate points and aspects, which is compelling. Now, if you're in a situation where one of your aspects, whether a character or a situational aspect, could make your character's life more dramatic or complicated, then someone can compel that aspect. In order to do this, the person doing the compelling explains why the aspect is relevant and makes an offer as to what the complication might be. For example, someone might say, well, since you are the wanted outlaw Tholas Vaughn, and we're passing through an Imperial outpost, a group of mercs have recognised you from a wanted poster and tried to apprehend you. When a compel is proposed, the player who has been compelled has two choices. They may either accept the compel, in which case the complication occurs and the compelled player receives a fate point, or they may refuse the compel, in which case the compelled player has to pay a fate point to prevent the complication occurring. As always, the GM is the final arbiter of whether a compel is valid or not. And please note, if a player wants to compel another PC, then it costs them a fate point to propose the complication, whereas GMs propose for free, and any player may propose a compel on their own character for free. If you notice during a game that you've fulfilled the criteria for a compel but you've not received a fate point, then mention this to your GM, and if they agree, they can award the fate point afterwards, and this is known as a retroactive compel. Okay, so finally, before we wrap this video up, let's talk about the fate point economy. Once you've been playing Fate for a while, you'll probably hear the term fate point economy bandied about a fair bit. And basically this is a fancy term for talking about the constant spending and earning of fate points. Now, fate points aren't something that you should be hoarding. You should be spending them freely and earning them back in equal measure regularly through compels. By doing this, you're reinforcing what your character is good at by spending them to invoke your aspects, and you're advancing the game fiction by accepting complications and compels, which also reinforce your character's personality and background. All of this for a very simple system. Not bad, huh? One thing to keep in mind is that although you might be spending fate points freely, and you may spot a lot of potential compels that could earn you fate points, the GM has an awful lot going on. They have to keep in mind all of the different player characters, and they may not have spotted a potential compel. If this is the case, then feel free to suggest the compel yourself for your own character. Most GMs will be glad that you're showing an interest and that you are engaged in the game. It advances the story and it also earns you fate points. At worst, the GM's going to say it's not applicable and you've lost nothing. So there we are, that's aspects in Fate Core. I hope if you've found this video useful, you'll consider clicking on the red dice up there to subscribe to my channel. If you like this video, hit it with a thumbs up. If you didn't like it, hit it with a thumbs down. And if you have any comments or questions, please put them in the comments box down below, or as always, hit me up in the Google Plus links. I love reading what you write. So until I see you in the next video, take care and happy gaming, however you choose to game.